The Kraken sucked this season. Again. And I'm sorry if that seems a little bit overly harsh to some of you. And yes, I do still love this team. I feel like that should be pretty obvious. I wouldn't spend nearly as much time as I do making videos about them if I didn't. But we gotta face the reality. You can try and talk yourself around it and make up whatever excuses you want. At the end of the year, they still finished 6th to last in the NHL, and some of the stats point to it could have actually been worse. Even still, though, I do think there's good reason to believe in not just the long-term future for the team, which I think we all see the bright spots there, but even the short-term future for them, and that this roster isn't as bad as they were, or shouldn't be as bad as they were certainly this last season, but really even each of the last two. So then what needs to happen for this team to get out of the slump or rut that they've been in here for the last couple of years and get back to where they were 3 years ago, get back to meeting or hopefully even exceeding expectations, and even getting to where ownership would like them to be here in the near future as a perennial playoff team, and even a couple years down the road once we start to get into the prime of some of that young drafted talent that they have, hopefully a cup contender. But before we get too ahead of ourselves and get into what the Kraken might actually do this offseason and some of what they've already done to make those changes necessary to get to that point of being hopefully soon a perennial playoff team, it would be valuable to one last time take a look back at where the Kraken are coming from, what went wrong in this season, and what they do then need to improve going into next season. And right out of the gate, the obvious one is team defense. This team was horrible defensively this season. Easily the worst that they've ever been. I mean, based on 5-on-5 expected stats, they've actually been a top 10 NHL team in expected goals against in all 3 previous years of their existence. And then this season dropped well into the bottom third of teams. And we already have seen that if you watch the player grades, that individually, there wasn't a single player on the team except for Matty Beniers that provided even above league average individual defense. And Beniers was significantly ahead of that, but he can't be a one-man defensive show, especially from a center forward position. And yeah, maybe some of, or at least a small chunk anyway, of those goals against average per game, both at 5-on-5 and in all situations, numbers that look pretty bad for the Kraken, the worst in both categories of their entire existence, are due to the worst of the 4 seasons of their existence of Philip Grubauer in net. An .875 save percentage and nearly a 3.5 goals against for Grubauer, but he only played the 26 games, which is the fewest he's played in a season for the Kraken, so that certainly cannot be responsible for the entire defensive collapse, especially because, well, for one, expected goal stats don't take goaltending into consideration, and when you look at the shots that the Kraken allowed per game against them, as well as the heat map of where those shots were coming from, it points to a pretty, well, bad and damning story for this Kraken defense, especially that heat map. In this case, red is bad, and it's pretty much entirely red, which means the Kraken were giving up more than the NHL average shots from all of those locations. And honestly, it's probably even worse than how all of that makes it look, because what those expected stats and the shooting heat map don't take into consideration, or at least generally don't do a very good job, if at all, take into consideration, is what the defense looked like when those shots were taken, which, as we know from having watched the games, certainly those of us that watched all the games, and especially towards the end of the season, but really throughout, the Kraken defensively were, through large chunks of the season, a complete mess and giving up a lot of odd man chances, allowing players to completely walk through their defense, get cross-seam passes to give their goaltender no chance. And I mean, generally, it was just at times clinic on how not to play defense in your own end of the ice. The Kraken are maybe even getting a little bit of a benefit from those stats not pointing at how bad the defense was and just showing where the shots were coming from. So when you mix those two together, it's going to be pretty tough for the goaltenders to make up too much of the difference. And while Grubauer wasn't doing much of that, Decor did his best. But yeah, at the end of the day, it all adds up to a team that was giving up more goals than the vast majority of teams in the league, and just about all of the teams that made the playoffs. Now, it's supposed to be totally fair as far as at least the shot volume against is concerned. At least when it comes to the drop in overall NHL ranking, where the Kraken actually gave up fewer shots against this season than they did last, but dropped from 8th to 26th. League-wide shooting volume was down, so while the Kraken kind of stayed roughly where they have been as far as giving up shots against as they have the last 3 years, because of the drop in league shooting, they ended up dropping pretty significantly in the rankings. Still, it's hard to not see the connection potentially between the drop in all of the Kraken defensive numbers and the change that was made in coaching staff. Especially going from a coaching staff in Dave Haxtell's that was unapologetically defense first and offense was a complete second thought, to Bialsma's, which was much more trying to stretch out the ice, fast-paced, open up some things offensively, and then hope that you can deal with things back the other way, which clearly the Kraken were not very good at dealing with things back the other way. Which maybe part of that had to do with them just not being as physical of a team when it comes to hitting as they had been the previous 2 years. Over the course of the first 3 seasons, they were getting more and more physical, more and more hits each season, and that's even after they got rid of Jeremy Lauzon halfway through the first season. They still managed to increase in hits per game each year, until this year, they fell all the way back to kind of where they started in that inaugural season, a significantly less physical team, which also probably played a role in why they took far fewer penalties than they have across their existence. But still, it does open things up a little bit when teams don't have to be as afraid of the Kraken putting bodies on bodies. Anyway, all this is to say, between the team numbers and the individual numbers that we saw during player grades, it was, again, a horrendous season for the Kraken defensively, certainly by their own standards at the very least, which at least there the good news is that there's an easy path for this team to get better, or at the very least, we know that pretty much this same roster can play much better defensively than they did this season with a different scheme for one thing, but at least we know that the talent is there to play a much more solid defensive game, and you'd have to hope so considering the amount of money that they're spending on the defensive end. So that part should be pretty solvable without having to make any big moves in free agency or via trade in the offseason. Meanwhile, on the other side of things, offensively, things were still an issue for the Kraken. Now, the numbers did generally get better for them than they have over the last couple of years under Haxtell. That whole opening up the ice and stretching things out offensively under Bialsma did work to an extent. The Kraken scored more than they did certainly last year, where they were one of the worst teams in the NHL. They got back to kind of league average, just under 3 goals per game, which put them right in the middle of the league. But even there, some of the more advanced stats, the expected goals, point to the Kraken maybe being a little bit on the fortunate end, and that, well, they just didn't really have the same expected stats as what they actually ended up getting in the net. I mean, at least according to Hockey Reference's numbers anyway, though really any of the expected goals models that you look at will tell a similar story, if not with slightly different numbers, that the Kraken, expected goals-wise at 5-on-5, were about as bad, if not slightly worse, than they were last season. Again, according to Hockey Reference, a 1.86 expected goals at 5-on-5 for, which would have finished them 30th in the NHL. Now, it gets a little bit better when you look at all situations, but even there, it was just a tough season for the Kraken as far as expected stats, but they were able to convert a little bit more frequently than they were under Haxtell. Now, again, I think that is to be expected with the change in systems, opening up the ice a little bit more, and maybe playing a little bit more off the rush with speed than they did under Haxtell. That is a style that does lend to a little bit better finishing, which we do see in their finishing heat map, but yeah, it's going to lead to a little bit better finishing than the dump and chase that Haxtell preferred to play. Even still, though, while I think you can explain some of it with the change in system, there still is enough of a gap there that even if the eye test, I mean, personally, these numbers surprised me a little bit. I would have expected with especially some of the players that seemed like they were snake bit over the course of the season, especially McCann, Beniers at points, Wright was on and off that list as well. I kind of expected the Kraken to be around average, if not slightly unlucky when it came to their finishing versus expected, but The numbers point to the Kraken maybe being a little bit on the lucky end offensively this year. So, well, yeah, I do think that they were generally a better team offensively this year than they were in the previous season, and not just because of the change in scheme, though that did play a role, but also the change in personnel. Brandon Montour obviously made a big difference offensively from the blue line, but even Chandler Stevenson in the back half of the season anyway certainly added to the Kraken offensive threat. Hurt, in Stevenson's case, hurt defensively, but offensively, those two additions did help the team this year. Still, it's clear that some more big changes are needed for the Kraken to get anywhere near where they need to be offensively to be in that conversation as a expected perennial playoff team. And we're not even getting into the realm of talking about cup contending. Now, as far as where those changes come from for the Kraken offensively, as far as personnel is concerned, we can talk about that a little bit more here in a second. But regardless of who's on the ice and what changes they make from this year to next, they need to figure out how to get to the front of the net more than they have this year, really ever. As that continues to be, looking again at one of these heat maps, this time blue being bad for the Kraken, you see once again another big dark blue void in front of the opposing net. And since that is obviously the most dangerous area for a team to be getting shots from, when you're one of the worst teams in the NHL fairly consistently at this point, with the exception of the season they made it to the playoffs, of getting shots even from those locations, you're going to have some trouble scoring. So if the Kraken want to score more consistently and try and find a way to not just hope to be NHL average, but get back to above average, maybe even back to one of the best scoring teams in the league like they were when they made the playoffs, they need to figure out how to get more net front presence in the offensive end and get more shot attempts from those areas. Again, that all comes down to just having players in front of the net, whether that's redirecting a shot, which would count as a shot from that area, a rebound chance, even just screening where the shot might not count on a shot chart. But yeah, the Kraken, it was a frustration really throughout the season. I don't know how many times I talked about it in R&Rs that the Kraken just were not getting traffic in front of the net. Now, there were a couple of players that started to do it more as the season went along. Jaden Schwartz led the team in goals for a good reason, and it was because he was probably the most consistent player on the team, certainly over the course of the whole year anyway, at going to the front of the net. We saw Shane Wright do it a little bit more as the season went along, and he started to have more and more success the more that he went to those areas, and just the way he plays the game lends itself to scoring pretty well, getting lost around the net. And obviously, some of the guys that are gone, like a Yanni Gourde, did that before he got hurt and then traded. But for the Kraken, again, regardless of what changes they make personnel-wise, who's on the ice next year, they need to probably scheme-wise figure out a way to change things to make that more of a priority. Now, one problem they have certainly is the size on the offensive end, where going to the front of the net, you're going to get punished, and the Kraken size-wise, as far as their forwards are concerned, are one of the smaller teams in the league. But even still, Jaden Schwartz is not a big player, and he's getting on the older end, has an history of injuries, and yet he was still up there creating chaos and getting rewarded for it by going there. So it's not like it's mutually exclusive that a player that's small can't go to the front of the net. Yanni Gourde, again, not a big player, went to the front of the net. Mikey Asiamont, we saw over the last few months, not as much net front presence, but he liked to create havoc around the net. Again, not a bigger player, so whether the Kraken solve that by getting bigger or just solve it by scheming, got to figure out how to get to the opposing net. And that will certainly help. And then there's the special teams, which once again for the Kraken were a bit of a sore spot. The special teams, both power play and penalty kill, have always been troublesome for this team. Even in the year where they did go to the playoffs and had that 100-point season, special teams have always been bad, whether it's the power play, which that I think can be attributed a little bit more to personnel, or even the penalty kill, where you would think a team that at least the 3 previous seasons had a better defensive mindset and scheme would be better at the kill, but they just have never really been good at either. The only time that they were even around league average at either one was they actually were over 20% on the power play last season, but this year the power play came back down again to 18.9% for 23rd in the league, and yet even though it finished 21st in the league with a 77 plus percentage, I honestly think the penalty kill was worse. Which I understand that might sound a little bit crazy and out there, especially with the recency bias of how poorly the power play finished the season for the Kraken. They had the 0 for 25 or 26 stretch before they got one or two right there at the end. The power play was absolutely dreadful over the last month plus of the year. But the penalty kill, again, between the two things, the penalty kill personnel-wise, you have much less of an excuse with all of the money you have on the defensive end and some pretty good defensive forwards. I mean, sure, the stats weren't necessarily there to support that aside from Beniers, and they even started to put Beniers on the penalty kill a little bit towards the end of the year, which maybe that helped a little bit. But if you look at that heat map for the penalty kill, it is almost completely, I mean, the yellow's an interesting choice, but it's about as dark as it can be all around. The Kraken were giving up shots from all over the place at a much higher than average rate across the league, and ultimately the only reason that this penalty kill is, 21st rather than 23rd or worse like the power play is because of one man, and that is Joey Daccord. I really see no other reason for it other than Daccord just kept the Kraken in it when they were on the kill, and defensively they continued to be a mess in their own end. There were large chunks of the season where on the kill the Kraken looked completely lost and without a plan, just four guys drifting around hoping that they ended up in a shooting or passing lane, and then hoping that Daccord could make up for the mistake when it turned out that they actually weren't. Now, kind of once per game Tanev would be until they traded him, and he was pretty good on the kill. It was about the only thing that Tanev did particularly well this season, and other than, continue to ingratiate himself to the fan base because he was still a fan favorite, but 5-on-5, he was a bit of a liability, especially considering his contract. Penalty kill-wise, he played pretty well. And still, regardless of whether Tanev or Gord were out there on the kill, the Kraken it was a complete adventure on the penalty kill, and pretty much it's the fact that Joey Daccord gets to participate in the kill versus not participate on the power play. Not that he'd really help on the power play, but you get my meaning. Joey Daccord is the only reason that the penalty kill looks at all better than the power play. Though honestly, I don't know that it really matters which one was worse than the other. The point is they were both terrible. The penalty kill, again, personnel-wise, has less excuse to be terrible, but they were both well below where they need to be for this team to get to where they want to be. Now, I suppose they have already, a proof of concept in that second season that you can still make the playoffs and even make it 14 games into the playoffs without good special teams, but it certainly would help. So then where do the Kraken go from here? What changes do they make in this offseason to get to that better place next year where they are competing for a playoff spot and we aren't in this same spot a third year in a row talking about how disappointing a season was and what the Kraken need to do to make it not disappointing? Well, they already did make two pretty big changes. If you somehow aren't already aware, they happened a couple weeks ago and I just hadn't quite gotten time with trying to catch up with some other things and just take a breath after the end of that long and somewhat grueling towards the end of it season for the Kraken. But the two big changes that they made were moving Ron Francis out of the GM role and I suppose technically promoting him to team president of team operations, then promoting Jason Botterill, who had been in the role of AGM for the Kraken for the last 4 years, up to the GM role. And the final big move, firing for second year in a row, firing the head coach, this time in Dan Bielsma, where they will now fully start a new head coaching search. As far as who the new head coach will be, I don't really even think there's that much point in wildly speculating who it's going to be. They did, in the interview with the change of GM, emphasize that they were just starting the search, but that there was going to be certainly consideration put around the fact that this is a younger franchise and they need someone that can work with younger players, which, in my eyes anyway, already discludes a couple of big names that might be available. But we'll see if they agree or disagree with that. There's certainly a couple names out there that I'd rather the Kraken steer clear of. And honestly, with one of them having already been an option previous and they didn't go that route, I think it'll probably work itself out. But we'll have to wait and see probably for another couple months. Certainly, I would expect, well, maybe not even through that. Maybe they'll make it happen before the drafts just so the new head coach can be around for the whole draft process and have a little bit of time to get to know the team and all that. But regardless of when that happens, we can talk about it a little bit more once we have some at least rumors, substantiated rumors, or once that move is made of hiring a new head coach. As far as the change in GM, well, I do very much understand the frustration. I mean, trepidation would be putting it nicely, of a lot of the other people in the Kraken sphere at Ron Francis getting promoted for what essentially has been failure for the last 2 years, and a roster that just has not gotten very close to the playoffs, aside from the 1 year where just the stars aligned and just about everybody on the roster had a career season. While it is on paper a promotion, it doesn't really read that way. Ultimately, what they're doing is promoting him to a role that he was kind of already doing for the team. He was doing the president and GM roles and taking him out of that GM chair. Which, considering that Ron had done some things very well in that GM chair, specifically drafting and trading, I don't hate that he's still a part of the organization and will have a voice in the room with some of those things, but he made it very clear that Botterill will have the final say in all GM duties, which includes player movement, trades, drafting, and signing new contracts, which is the one thing that Francis just never really seemed to do that well. The Kraken don't have a ton of great free agent signings, and even the ones that do seem like good signings. I mean, Schwartz has played well for the team, and obviously Montour, it's only been 1 year, but it was a pretty good year. Even those contracts don't seem to age all that well. I mean, Montour's, we'll see, still 6 more years on that, and so far it's been good. But then there's plenty of contracts that certainly didn't work out. Certainly the big obvious ones where just saying they didn't work out might be putting it somewhat lightly, would be contracts like Grubauer's contract that, well, we'll get to that, Burakovsky's and Chandler Stevenson, which again, that one's pretty new into it, but even the first year didn't go particularly well for the amount the Kraken signed him for, and there's still 6 more years that get him well into his 30s that the Kraken are going to be paying Stevenson, so he's going to really have to keep up how he played offensively in the back half of the season and then play well defensively too for that to even to start to look like it might be worth it. So all that to say, taking the pen out of Ron Francis's hands during free agency might be for the best. And as far as the guy whose hand it is going into in Botterill, he did already have one stint as a GM in the NHL. He filled that role for Buffalo for a couple of years. And obviously, since Buffalo has not made the playoffs for quite some time, it didn't necessarily work out for him in Buffalo. But I'm not going to really spend too much time diving into his history as a GM with the Sabres because, quite frankly, I just don't think there's that much value in doing so. Because, well, for one, even if things didn't work out that well for Botterill as GM, it's not like it's worked that well for anybody in Buffalo. And that could very well be because of the at least heavily rumored or implied meddling that has gone on from the ownership over there, which certainly seemed to play a role at the time that Botterill was there in why things weren't necessarily going the way that the GM would have liked them to. Still, we'll have to wait and see. Personally, I'll reserve judgment and just see how this offseason, the draft, what free agent signings, what trades could be made, how it goes, and we'll take it one step at a time there, which will kind of be the approach for the new head coach as well. But these are significant changes, even if both are promotions. I mean, again, Ron Francis getting promoted, I think, is more a promotion on paper, but it's not really a demotion, but effectively it puts him in more of a role where he can do the things that he was doing well and puts a new person in the role of the things that maybe weren't going as well for Ron Francis here over the last couple seasons. So at least for now, I'm feeling optimistic about those changes. I understand why people might be feeling a little bit frustrated about what does on paper look like failure upwards for a couple of members of the front office. But I would think it's safe to say that if things continue to go this direction, those are pretty hot seats. And with ownership making it clear that they want this team to be competitive, and they're willing to spend like it too. I mean, that's one reason to be optimistic, is that the ownership here does care and does want this team to be successful. They're willing to spend like it, spend up to the cap, which is going to keep going up. So it's not like we have a Mariners situation on our hands where, sure, the talent's coming up, but they're just not going to spend to help out that talent and make the team competitive anyway. And yeah, I understand I'm saying that as the Mariners are one of the hottest teams in baseball, but we've been here before. I will believe it when I see it that they've won the division for the first time since 2001. It's a whole separate issue. But the point is, ownership cares, they're willing to spend, so as long as the right people get put in the right seats, the Kraken do have a strong farm system, and they just need to figure out a way to get some good talent around it. Now, as far as what that looks like this offseason, again, defensively, I don't think they really have to make any additions, which is probably a good thing because they really don't have room to on the defensive end. They've already spent way more than just about, well, certainly more than most teams in the NHL have spent on the blue line. So the money, if they're going to spend more, should go to the forward end, where, I mean, like I said, for one thing, defensively, the Kraken, we've seen this roster or a similar roster play well defensively. So, with a new scheme, they can probably get back to that. But offensively, aside from the year where just everything went their way and they made the playoffs, it's just never been a team with a huge offensive ceiling. Now, again, the future does look bright with some of the offensive talent that's coming up and still maturing at the NHL level. Matty Beniers, I mean, obviously the defensive side is more his thing, and the offensive side may or may not ever fully be there, but you'd have to expect that he'll get better offensively as he gets older and closer into his prime, so every year forward should be an improvement. And while the sophomore slump seems to have taken hold a little bit, this year was still an improvement for him offensively over last season. Then Shane Wright started the year off pretty cold, but certainly picked up as the season went along. Now, a lot of, I think, the inconsistency with the finish to Wright's season was the inconsistency in role and ice time that he saw, so we'll see what that looks like going into next year. Beyond that, I mean, yeah, you're going to need some other improvements from within. You'll need Capo Caco to play well in a full season with the Kraken, and you'll need better performances from a Chandler Stevenson, or at least a more consistent over a full season from a guy like Chandler Stevenson. You'll probably need Burakovsky to pick things up to some degree. I mean, you do need Burakovsky getting paid $5.5 million for the next 2 years to pick things up a bit offensively, assuming they don't buy him out, which is a possibility. There is another player that I would expect to be seeing that buyout option take hold, but we'll get to that in a second. As far as then who you could go pick up, well, for one, some of that could come from within the organization. They've already mentioned that both Yanni Newman, who we saw for a few games at the NHL level and played very well as Berkeley Catton, could both get real looks at making the NHL roster out of camp. And then there's what they could do in free agency or trade. I don't know how much point, again, that there is in speculating about what trades the Kraken could make, but we know that they've got, well, 4 first-round picks over the next 2 seasons after this year's draft, and at least 2 of them that they just traded for and have made pretty clear that they're more than happy to use as trade, I don't want to say trade bait, but ammunition in trades this offseason or even during the season if that's what it comes to. And then as far as free agency is concerned, we'll see who ends up making it to free agency. Right now, there are a couple of decently big names, certainly the biggest of which being Mitch Marner. John Tavares is also there, though certainly getting towards the end of his career, and how big of a role he would actually play in improving a team like the Kraken offensively, I'm not terribly convinced of. He has had success this season. I think it was 38 goals that he had for the Leafs, but he's playing with Mitch Marner and Austin Matthews, which he would not be playing with them in Seattle. Marner, well, I would be excited if Mitch Marner ended up in Seattle. He is very much of a playmaker rather than the goal scorer, so unless he can play make well enough to really set up a guy like Shane Wright to pop off offensively, I kind of don't know how good of a fit that would be. Then there's the names that we've also heard of that have some contention on which side you're on, like a Brock Besser. Personally, I don't know that that's necessarily the best route for the Kraken to go down, but it's certainly an option. There's also Ehlers that's out there, could be an option if not re-signed. But this is not particularly a deep free agency class that the Kraken are going to have to pick from, especially considering and even understanding that he did have a good year offensively in Chicago. One of the top 10 to 12 unrestricted free agency players at this moment, even before players start getting re-signed as teams get knocked out of the playoffs, is Ryan Donato. So in a free agency class, not to take anything away from Donato, who did score 30 goals, where Donato is a top 10 player before every re-signing is made, I don't think that free agency is necessarily where the Kraken are going to make their big splash, but I mean, if Marner leaves Toronto, if Toronto completely collapses in the rest of this first round or the second round, maybe that's a place they look at going. Of course, there they will have to sign a pretty big contract, and that in itself is a little bit scary. We'll have to see what Botterill signing free agents looks like, or even just re-signing Kraken players. I mean, that's another place that weirdly enough, even though his track record with signing free agents wasn't great, Ron Francis did a pretty good job with his Kraken re-signings. I mean, the Beniers contract is going to look pretty good towards the end of it, I think we'd have to expect. The Jared McCann one was a steal at the moment it was signed. Yeah, the Adam Larson one that just got signed, and depending on if he can bounce back defensively, the Vince Dunn one are a bit 50-50, but he did a lot better at signing his own players to new contracts than signing new players to the Kraken. We'll have to see if Botterill can keep that up, as he's going to have to re-sign. You'd have to expect Riker Evans, as well as hopefully Capo Caco, so we'll see what those contracts look like. But one contract that I would kind of expect to go the other way, in that it gets taken off the Kraken books, or mostly off anyway, would be Philip Grubauer. I think we again have seen the last of Grubauer in Seattle. More than likely he will get bought out, and the Kraken will look for a new, cheaper option as a backup for Decord. And, well, the cap is going to go up, so that'll certainly help the Kraken in signing free agents or signing the contracts for their RFAs that they still need to. Getting the buyout for Grubauer through will also save them almost $4 million to the cap this season. Then here, I'll put up the whole graph so you can see it, and then it'll hurt the Kraken a couple years down the road as that buyout spreads out. They'll be basically down $1.6 million for a couple years after Grubauer's contract would have ended. But considering he's just not even giving them backup level goaltending for $5.9 million, they just can't afford to keep that on the books over the next couple of years if they actually do want to contend, which so far every signal that they've given is that that is the plan. And again, when I say contend, I mean contend for a playoff spot, not the cup, though. You know, if everything goes perfectly, crazier things have happened, but it would be kind of crazy. So then, one more time, in summary, the Kraken were terrible defensively and still not great offensively, which contributed to the incredibly disappointing season. For them to get back to, or back to where they were a few years ago, and back to where they would like to be in a playoff team at the very least, they'll need to have the team defensive structure improve from within, most likely, and get back to where it was kind of under the Hackstall system, though obviously they're not going to bring Hackstall back. And then offensively, they're going to need to make some changes, as well as hope for steps forward from their young players and rebounds from some of their veterans that haven't been performing at the level as expected. So again, offensively, you're talking about Chandler Stevenson having a consistent good year, Burakovsky, assuming he doesn't get bought out, having at least an acceptable top, I mean, he's not going to be top 6 probably, but a top 9 type of player. And then steps forward from your Beniers, Shane Wright, Jared McCann getting back to hopefully around 30 goals scoring. And I mean, I don't know that you can really expect much more out of a Jaden Schwartz, but you're going to need some steps forward by players. And hopefully that change comes from within, as well as then making one, maybe 2 big moves on the forward end in the offseason, whether via trade or free agency. But as always, I'd love to know what you think down in the comment section below, what changes you'd like to see the Kraken make. Feel free to be specific if there's any specific free agents or trade targets that you could see the Kraken going after. Again, a lot of that will depend on what teams feel like they want to shake things up after potentially disappointing playoff runs, or a team going all the way and they've got some free agents that need or want bigger contracts than the team can afford. There's always going to be some big changes that are unexpected as we go into an offseason. But again, let me know what you think. Any specific players for any of those, or what players on the Kraken roster you'd like to see make, what changes maybe you'd like to see to the Kraken roster, maybe moving players around or whatnot. I'd love to know all of your thoughts as we go into this offseason. Down in the comments, heck, even if it's just who you might like to see the Kraken draft in this upcoming draft, if you've already started looking at that. Love to see all of it down in the comments. And until next time, which could be a head coach, could be just about anything. Stay safe out there. Be good to each other. God bless, and go Kraken.